Prompted that December by Trump's recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and only hardened by the policies that followed, ending U.S. funding for the UN Palestinian Refugee Agency,
and for the first time, to the Embassy of the United States,
and moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. A former Israeli UN ambassador says Israel should be grateful for Trump's support, but also wary of reliance on one president and one party.
The main task of the Israeli Prime Minister and whoever becomes President of the United States on November 3rd would be to bring back that bipartisanship and restore the traditional, historic relation between Israel and the United States, regardless of who is in the White House.
Last year, Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Heights, having a settlement named for him in return. In January this year came the distillation of his policy on Israel-Palestine, the Trump plan envisioning Israeli annexation of 30% of the occupied West Bank. Hussam Zumlot was the Palestinian representative in Washington until the U.S. shut down the mission in 2018.
Trump, what he's done is not only biased towards Israel, it's biased towards Israel's expansion. It's an absolute adoption of Israel's colonization, Israel's occupation. It's an adoption of the Israeli settler movement ideology, fully.
In the end, annexation was put on pause, with the White House worried it could derail its plan and damage regional alliances. Normalization with the UAE provided the exit ramp. The Palestinians are trying to fight the idea that they've been left marginalized, Mahmoud Abbas calling for a multilateral peace process to replace the American-led one. But both he and Netanyahu know from the last 4 years how much a US president can shape their conflict. Both know how much rides on the outcome of this election. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, occupied East Jerusalem.
All right, let's discuss this further now with our panel. Joining us in Haifa, we have Diana Bhutto, who's a human rights lawyer and a former spokeswoman for the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Nancy Soderberg is a former U.S. ambassador to the UN under the Clinton administration, and our senior political analyst, Marwan Bashar, once again. Thank you all for being here. Diana Bhutto, let me start with you. Let me ask you first about what the Trump administration has meant for Palestinians. Has Donald Trump been their worst nightmare to come?
Yes, most definitely. I think it's very important to keep in mind what exactly President Trump has done. He has ticked off virtually every item off of Netanyahu's wish list, whether it was recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, moving the embassy, allowing for Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, closing the embassy, the Palestinian embassy, cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority, shutting down Palestinian hospitals as much as he could, and also cutting funding to the Palestinian Authority. What the Israelis have long wanted is to see Palestinians disappear, and they now have, or they have had, a president in place who has made sure that virtually every item on their wish list has come true. So another 4 years is just going to mean even more of that, and the attempt to virtually extinguish Palestinians and their rights.
Nancy Soderberg, Diana Bhutto says another 4 years would be catastrophic. Would a Biden administration be able to define relations between Israelis and Palestinians differently? How might they do it? Will they reverse a decision, for instance, to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the move to the embassy, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've seen under President Trump is a real risk to a two-state solution. And that's the big question that I think the next president's going to have to deal with. And that has serious questions for Israel remaining a democracy. And I think what you've seen is a shift in the thinking of the United States to remove ourselves as an honest broker in that area. Whether we can get that back is a big question. And I think the Arab states, not yet Saudi Arabia, but you've got Bahrain, UAE, Sudan, not yet Saudi Arabia, but I think what you've seen is an increase in the concern about a rising Iran. And now that the nuclear program is kind of back on track, and so you see the Arab states, it's really now become a Sunni Shia competition in the Middle East, and whether or not a Biden administration can shift that back, hopefully put the nuclear genie back in the bottle in Iran, and get back to trying to really work on a two-state solution. I honestly don't know whether that is still possible given what's happened.
Let me ask you, Marwan, do you think a two-state solution is still viable?
No, it's not, and it hasn't been for a while. What Trump did, I won't say to his credit, but certainly what he did was basically push a reality that already exists in Palestine, which is an Israeli dictatorship. Yes, Israel is a democracy for its Jewish population, but it's certainly been a dictatorship in Palestine, and hence his policy towards Israel has been reflective of his overall policy in the Middle East, which is support dictatorships. And it's, in fact, the support for dictatorships against their own people that brought Israel and some of the Arab dictators together. I don't think it was just Iran. Yes, Iran was a factor, but the real factor was democracy and human rights for the Palestinians and for the Arabs. That's why an autocracy, if you will, like the Trump administration, basically brought together an Israeli dictatorship, an Arab dictatorship, and called it peace.
Right. But it was supposed to be the deal of the century, Marwan.
Yes, it was supposed to be the deal of the century. But I think, you know, once this night is over, a new dawn, if you will, is upon us in America. I think not many people are going to remember Jared Kushner, for all the cases that we have now. It's not going to be a deal of the century. It's going to be the escape of the century. Right. We might end up, seeing him in Tel Aviv in a coffee shop rather than being in another administration. But just one last word on that. Believe me, if Trump wins again, Jared Kushner could be the next Secretary of State.
All right. Well, we're not there yet. And we will see what happens in the next few hours. Diana Bhutto, we talked about normalization and the fact that the U.S. has this deal now with a number of Arab nations to normalize relations with Israel. It's clear, having spoken to many Palestinian leaders over the last few weeks, that they feel abandoned by the Arab world, by their traditional allies. What happens if more normalization deals are agreed, if the big one, of course, Saudi Arabia, agrees to normalize relations with Israel?
Look, Israel can try to normalize with as many countries as it wants to, but at the end of the day, it knows, and we know, and the world knows, that it is not normal. It's an occupier. It's an oppressor. It's a colonizer, and so they can try as much as they want to ignore Palestinians, to go around us. But at the end of the day, Israel knows that the only way that they will ever have any semblance of peace is if they actually end their military rule over Palestinians. They can try to go around us as much as they want to. They've been trying to for decades, but we know that the key rests with Palestinians. It's just a shame that we see that these Arab dictatorships, that these Arab regimes are trying to normalize things that are abnormal rather than standing firm and standing strong and standing tall and standing against the very reason that we do not have self-determination in the Arab world as a whole because of the presence of Israel. I would have expected that instead they would stand alongside those who've been oppressed rather than those who are doing the oppressing. But this is the world that we're living in these days.
Nancy Soderberg, how is the normalization deal, the so-called Abraham Accord, how is that being viewed in the U.S.? It seems both parties, Democrats and Republicans, are in favor of it, despite it being unfavorable to Palestinians.
Yeah. Americans on the Democratic side and the Republican side both want Israel to get recognized by the Arab world and to have peace established with its Arab neighbors. I think the challenge here going forward is how are you going to deal with not just the issue of the Palestinian question, which I was in the Clinton administration and we almost got it on the eve of his last month in office, peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and fell apart. Dates back to when Rabin was assassinated, and I think the real hope for peace was severely damaged back then, and we've been struggling ever since. But I think the broader picture here is how do we deal with Saudi Arabia? Because that's pulling the strings here. They could push the narrative much farther in terms of trying to get an Arab position on supporting a Palestinian statehood, on trying to push back on Iran. But you're dealing with a Saudi Arabia that I think is getting more dangerous, not less. And to me, that's going to be a huge issue for an incoming Biden administration is can we establish that relationship to a little bit more normal. And lastly, I'll just add, we will have professionals involved in this process that understands the nuances and don't just kind of have deals that are reflecting reality, kind of low-hanging fruit, but really getting at some of the tougher ones with much more professional.
Let me ask Marwan briefly, how do you think a Biden administration would deal with Saudi Arabia?
It will deal with it very differently from the Trump administration. Let's all remember that Trump started his tenure by visiting Riyadh and embracing the Saudi dictatorship and, in fact, embracing its war in Yemen. I think like that in Saudi Arabia, the Trump administration also embraced the dictatorship in Egypt. They basically embraced every other dictator in the Middle East. And I think Biden will probably take a distance from the Saudi monarch. It will take a distance from the Egyptian dictatorship. It will be different. I don't think it's going to be perfect. I don't think it's going to be the best thing ever. But certainly it will contrast dramatically with Trump's policy towards those dictatorships.
Marwan, thank you. Thank you, all three of you, for this interesting discussion. Let's now check in with Leah. Donald Trump has had a very public and turbulent history with social media and has been even censored by Twitter. Leah, tell us more.
Yeah, he has, Folly. After taking office, Donald Trump quickly went from being called commander-in-chief to being called the tweeter-in-chief. And his relationship with Twitter has been rather unusual, as I'm sure you know. It started with him actually censoring himself. This is a list of all of the tweets that he has deleted himself. 926 of them, actually, in total, including this really famous one when he said, despite the constant negative press, Kafefe. He deleted that a few hours after he posted it. Then Twitter actually started censoring the president. In May, he tweeted twice saying that mail-in ballots were going to be fraudulent. But Twitter put up this warning on each of them, encouraging voters to get the facts about mail-in ballots. Then in June, Trump said that there would be violence in Washington, D.C., in the U.S. Capitol following the death of George Floyd. Twitter hid the tweet, saying that it violated its rules about glorifying violence. The tweet can still be viewed. You just have to click on that little warning sign first. And then the list just keeps on going. In October, Trump said that COVID was less lethal than the flu. Facebook actually deleted this post. Twitter hid it, saying it spread potentially harmful information. And his most recent censored tweet was actually just posted yesterday on Monday when he warned of violence on the streets. Twitter responded with a link about how voting is safe and secure. Now, Trump has come back at social media saying that an executive order has been signed to end a law called Section 230. It allows social media sites to edit content that they deem inappropriate. If this is repealed, these companies could actually be sued for blocking and changing content from users like Trump's tweets. But interestingly, Joe Biden also wants to repeal that law. It may be one of the few things the presidential hopefuls agree on.
Leah, thank you very much. It is now midnight GMT and voting is ending in 6 states on the East Coast this hour. Kamal is here with the early numbers and projections.
Yes,
Excitement.
we've got something to talk about.
Finally.
7 p.m. Well, let's temper our expectations. Not that much, but we have got real data coming in. Hello, everyone. 7 p.m. on the US East Coast. It is now, as Folly said, midnight GMT. 6 states are closing. Let's take you through them. They are Indiana, Kentucky, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia and Vermont. A mixture of states there. Some of them are our swing states. Some of them are very solid. And these are the projections we have for you at this hour. Starting in Kentucky, with its 8 electoral college votes, they go the way of Donald Trump. That is exactly as we would expect. We'll just have a look at some of the detail on it of the popular vote. And it's solid, isn't it? 53%. With 14%, and this is just how to understand it, even with only 14% of precincts reporting, it is enough for us to be able to make a solid projection for Donald Trump. Also, looking at Vermont, which is going to the column of Joe Biden, the 3 electoral college votes which the Democratic candidate pretty much always gets at this time of the night. And just running through a few others now. The polls have closed, but that doesn't mean we can actually decide at this point. Indiana, too early to call in Indiana with its 11. South Carolina as well with its 9 is too early to call, as is Virginia. More on offer in Virginia, 13. That should be blue when the time comes, but it was a swing state in past years. And finally, we will look at Georgia, which very much is one of our swing states this year. 16 electoral college votes, too early to call. Let's have a look at the breakdown, the state profile, as we like to call it, on Georgia to give you a little more information about what we can expect. Have a look at the close-up there. We'll show you the numbers there that Donald Trump won pretty convincingly, a good 5% win in 2016. Romney and McCain easily before him. But the fact is, this time around, it is very much in play. A lot of it to do with some of the suburban areas around Atlanta. These are places which have been going bluer over the past few years, and that includes in midterm elections and local elections. So it is a case of how blue those areas can turn as to whether Joe Biden and the Democrats can flip that. Let's have a look at the state of the race. Here it comes, and 8-3. So that's how you expect it at this point. Just a few numbers that we are able to confirm at this point. However, this hour, midnight, is one where we do have some states closing on the half hour. It doesn't happen that many times in the night. So in about 25 minutes' time, you'll see me back here again, and we will talk about Ohio, West Virginia, and North Carolina. Important ones there, aren't they? Ohio, of course, which always picks the winner, and North Carolina, which is in play as a swing state as well. There you go, Folly.
Those are the early numbers, a number of states that have closed polls, but too early to call.
In 4 of them.
And we're looking forward to Ohio, of course, in about 30 minutes or so. Come out.
I will see you for that.
Thank you for the moment. Well, let's get reaction from our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, to these early numbers. President Donald Trump watching the results. Kimberly, Mike Hanna is also with us in Wilmington, Delaware, the home state of Democratic candidate Joe Biden. Kimberly, let me start with you. First polls closing. Is there one particular state the Trump campaign will be looking at early on to see how things are going?
Well, we've just gotten off a call with the campaign, and what I can tell you is that 2 states they're feeling good about right now are Michigan and also Arizona. Now, they say that they are feeling positive. They say that the turnout there has been very solid. And you have to remember that while we had an enormous surge in early votes that favored Joe Biden, Donald Trump was counting on his supporters to stand in line. So we've even seen his son, Donald Trump Jr., saying, make sure if you're in line, you stay in line and get your chance to vote, even if the polls have closed. It's an awareness and an understanding by this campaign that this could be decided on a razor-thin margin in just a handful of states, Michigan being one of them. Of course, the campaign also trying to flip for a second time Pennsylvania, but we may not know that result for some time. But again, this White House watching these and the returns come in the White House behind me. They are preparing the East Room for some sort of statement from Donald Trump. But again, we don't know when to expect it or what he will say, only that they continue to express optimism.
Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C. Let's cross over to Mike Hanna now in Wilmington, Delaware. Mike, as you heard Kimberly say there, the Trump campaign very confident about Michigan and Arizona. What is the Biden camp confident about this hour? What states do they think they have?
Well, Joe Biden, in the course of the day, made very clear that he's not going to be saying anything until, as he put it, he's got something to say. He spent the day in Pennsylvania, a very, very close state. This is part of the blue wall: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Now, we heard there my colleague Kimberly Halkett saying about the Trump campaign feeling confident about Michigan. Well, I'm hearing from the Biden campaign very quietly that they are also confident about Michigan. Now, these are key states, that blue wall, absolutely key. The other areas that the Biden campaign are going to be watching very, very carefully, of course, with everything else, and that's the Sun Belt: Texas, Arizona, and Georgia. In particular, Georgia, where we're waiting for some results to start trickling out of there within the next hour or so. Now, these are states that have been traditionally red. They have been Republican for decades. However, Georgia is now in play. The Biden campaign spotted that. They sent Vice President nominee Kamala Harris there. They've sent Joe Biden there. This is a critical state for them because to get this kind of momentum early in the evening is something that could translate as other results come in throughout the course of the night. But as I'm saying, the Biden campaign, very quiet at the moment. Joe Biden himself sitting at home, we are told, watching results with his family. The convention center behind us here, you heard a brief spurt of music, but everything very quiet, very self-contained at the moment. Everybody watching, waiting closely, but watching, as I say, both that blue wall and that sunbelt, because results out of those two will give a very strong indicator of which way this election is going to go, Foley.
And we're waiting for the results from Ohio in about 23 minutes from now. Mike Hanna in Wilmington, Delaware, thank you for the moment. We have a report from Al Jazeera's Washington Jordan now, rounding up election day so far. Take a look.
The polling place lines that formed early and seemed to go on forever. This is just one of the things Americans will tell their grandchildren about the presidential election of 2020.
Biden wants you in chains. Don't forget that.
They'll also talk about the partisanship bordering on hatred.
And I come from a communist country. And I disagree with Joe China. He part of the swamp, Washington swamp.
I saw the Trump supporters over there and I decided to pull over and I picked up a sign and I've been standing here with it in the last hour or so.
Where'd you get the sign from?
From the ground.
The roadside rallies and hours-long waiting to vote were the highlights of this final day of voting for U.S. president. In some states, residents have been voting since September, in part because of local efforts to stem the spread of COVID-19. The result, more than 100 million ballots already cast before November 3rd, setting up possibly the highest voter turnout in more than a century. But how quickly can poll workers count the vote and announce who has won the White House? The Department of Homeland Security is trying to reassure the public.
Rest assured, however, our partners at the state and local level are working around the clock to make sure that each vote is counted properly, but it is important to recognize that this process may require time.
But much of the uncertainty has been stirred up by the president himself, who has questioned the legality of early voting and lengthy vote counts, has accused Democrats of trying to steal the election, and has threatened to sue if he loses.
The whole world is waiting. This country is waiting, but the whole world is waiting. And a lot of shenanigans, a lot of bad things happen with ballots when you say, oh, let's devote days and days, and all of a sudden the ballot count changes.
Trump's Democratic rival stuck to a more optimistic message when he thanked supporters in Philadelphia.
We choose hope over fear. We choose truth over lies. We choose science over fiction. We can take this. I promise you. I promise you.
As the polling places start to close, Americans and the world now wait, hoping there will be once again a peaceful transition to the next president and administration in the United States. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera.
All right, let's go now to the crucial battleground state of Florida, where the polls will be closing at 1 GMT. Andy Gallagher in Miami for us. Andy, Miami, a predominantly Democratic stronghold where Biden needs, of course, a big lead if he has any chance of winning Florida.
Yeah, I mean, what the Biden campaign wants more than anything else are decisive results in this, the biggest battleground state in the entire election. 29 electoral college votes here. Only Texas and California has more. But the importance of Florida can't be overstated. Excuse me. Because how Florida goes, the nation tends to go as well, because of the demographics here. So the precincts are starting to report now very slowly.
Okay.
Excuse me.
Sorry.
So we will be getting the results, I think, in the next kind of half an hour or so.
Okay, Andy, we'll check in with you a little later. For the moment, thank you, Andy Gallagher in Miami. Now, we've heard a couple of times tonight already from Alan Lichtman, and he's with us again from Bethesda, Maryland. He's a professor of history at the American University and the author of the Keys to the White House, a system that's correctly predicted the outcome of U.S. presidential races since 1984. And it's not one-sided, I have to say, Professor. You're a Democrat, and you even predicted Donald Trump's win in 2016. Tell us about your reaction.
I got this note from him.
Yeah,
yes,
I see that.
I certainly did.
Well done. So how are you feeling in 2020? What's your prediction?
Well, 2020 is the most unusual election. And I've been doing this for nigh on 40 years, ever since I predicted Ronald Reagan's reelection in 1982. And by the way, going into this year, I've predicted 4 Republicans, 5 Democrats, as nonpartisan as you can get. But here's what happened in this most bizarre of elections. My 13-key system measures the strength and performance of the party holding the White House. The long-term economic key, because of negative growth, despite the third quarter spike, which was from a very low base compared to the first 2 quarter declines, and the social unrest that's raging across the land. So he is now down 7 keys, right. 1 more that is needed to predict his defeat.
Okay, so your prediction is that he will lose this election. Just out of curiosity, Professor, out of all the indicators, did anyone ever get the perfect score, 13?
One person did, and it was a Republican, Theodore Roosevelt, in 1904, when he ran for re-election, did rack up an